Hello and welcome one and all. I can see we've already got a few people watching, but brilliant, more people are joining already. Well, hello and thanks for tuning in. I am Alex Cox, joined by some very special guests today for a very special live panel discussion. So what are we talking about today? Well, one of the things we want to highlight is family history generally isn't just our business, it is our passion, as well as providing loads of tools and resources for exploring your roots. We're also avid users of them. So in an effort to inspire others to start their own journeys of discovery, we're celebrating discoveries of all kinds, mainly our own, but also yours. So yeah, today we will be talking about discoveries, special important discoveries to us that we've made during the course of our own research, how those made us feel. We'll be sharing some top tips for making your own discoveries, discussing why family history matters, why it's important. Basically, it's a general chat around the many joys of exploring your roots online. One of the reasons we're doing this is we're also running a campaign on our blog at the moment. So if you enjoyed today's discussion and you'd like to find out more about the amazing discoveries that members of the Findmypast team have been making, you can visit our blog. There's a link at the bottom of the page where you can read posts from various team members from across the business detailing their discoveries in depth. There's also a video on our YouTube page as well, with some little sound bites from various people sharing what they've discovered and how that's impacted them. And lastly, before we dive into the real meat of today's discussion, I just wanted to invite you all to share your own discoveries. Ellie has informed me that quite a few people have been asking, can I record my own discoveries and send them in? The answer is yes, you very much can. If you've made a discovery that you'd like to share with us and that you'd be happy for us to share with the world, please do send them in to discoveries@findmypast.com. So yeah, get involved, join the discussion. So who am I joined by today? Well, I'm joined by Jen Baldwin, Brian Donovan, Niall Cullen, and we're going to have a very fun, entertaining chat, I think, over the course of the next hour. So, hi guys, thank you for coming on. Do you want to maybe go one by one and say hello and a little bit about yourself?
Brian's first.
Well,
I'm first, am I guess because I'm old. I'm Brian Donovan. I work with the content team, and we at the content team are responsible for finding the brilliant records you find on our site, looking after them, managing them, making sure that they're as good as they can be, and assisting in everything to do with family history on the site.
Jen, go on.
Yeah, so Jen Baldwin, I'm based in Colorado in the United States. I'm data acquisition manager for North America, and I also lead our global ambassador program. So I find information to publish, and I help people tell stories. It's great.
And last by no means least, Niall.
Thank you very much, Alex. I'm Niall Cullen. I work on the marketing team of Findmypast. Specifically, I'm content marketing lead, which basically means that all of the records that the licensing team and the content team bring to us, we have to then bring that to you. So package it up, send it out to you. All of the blogs, all of the social media that you see, that all comes through our team.
Brilliant. Well, before we dive in again, I just want to remind everybody we are taking questions, so please do get involved, share, as well as sending them through to our inbox. If you've got anything you'd like to share with today's audience, do share your discoveries in the comments. And also, it'd be great if you could tell us a little bit about how those discoveries made you feel. Brilliant. So yeah, without further ado, let's start talking. Why don't we start off by how did each of you kind of get started on your family history journey?
Who wants to go first?
Go on now.
This is not a group of shy people, so we should all put something in here.
You might have to nominate us each time, Alex.
Yeah, you might.
So my family history journey really started when I started working with Findmypast. It's 8 years ago, last week actually, so quite a long time I've been with the company. And obviously, when you join a family history company, one of the first things that you're going to do is do a little bit of your own family history. I probably knew as far back as my great-grandparents, which I think a lot of people would be in the same position, at least knew their names. But I had never delved in any further. So yeah, joining Findmypast really gave me the kind of impetus to go and look into my family tree, build branches, and I will share with you over the next hours some of the great discoveries that I've had.
Go on, Jan.
I'm always in the middle. That's fine. So my story actually starts when I was about 10 years old. We have in the States, it's very common to have a school project around your ancestors or interviewing a family member. And I chose my grandfather. I didn't know at the time that he had early onset stage of Parkinson's. And so he didn't really remember very much. And my grandma was worried that he would give me a incorrect story. So she sat with us, and she must have seen something in me because she started telling me more stories. And every time I went and visited grandma, she would tell me stories about the family, and she would feed me cookies. And so I thought it was well worth it. And she started taking me to cemeteries and that kind of thing. So my journey started young, I think like many others out there. And then I entered the realm of professional genealogy about 14 years ago or so. And I've been with Findmypast for 7.
Brilliant. And Brian?
Well, I grew up in a very old house, a house that had been with my family for over 300 years. And I was surrounded by a family who seemed to know everything. And I was a kind of precocious teenager. You've probably never heard of things like that.
I can't imagine. No chance.
And I set out on a mission to actually prove everything I've been told was wrong, as you do when you're that age. So that's what got me involved in family history. It was basically to get up the nose of my dad, I think, first and foremost. And it started an extraordinary journey, a journey of discovery not only of my family and its history, but also a journey of discovery of a relationship with my father. And that they're very much wrapped up together. And so when I was in my late teens, I decided to go to university, study history. I became an academic historian for quite some time, and then eventually moved into family history as a business and as a service. So that's my route.
Well, what you said, I think, about the family connection is so important. That's certainly what got me started. I think most families tend to have at least one member who is the self-appointed, usually family chronicler, and that was my grandfather, who I was lucky I had a very close relationship with. So I was brought up hearing all these stories, and then it wasn't until I started working at Findmypast that, like you, Brian, I started to be able to disprove most of them, but prove some of them prove some of them also. And now he has sadly passed away. I've kind of made myself the self-appointed family historian, so relatives can always rely on me to bore them at length with details they never really felt like asking about. But I can just see that loads of people are already commenting. We've got lots of people saying hello. We've got someone complimenting you on your accent, Niall.
It's funny that they compliment mine and not Brian's, because we're both Irish, so we should have similar accents, but that's interesting.
I actually think you guys sound very different.
Good.
But yeah, no, thanks for everybody who is commenting. Do keep those coming. We've got Amanda Webb, who's a very frequent commenter on our videos, and also someone who could write a book with the number of amazing discoveries she's made over the years. She said, "Love your records from Midlands County's ancestors. Wills, parish records, and marriage licenses. Made so many discoveries thanks to these records. I don't know where to start." Thank you very much, Amanda, for sharing that. Let's have another look. Beverly Robertson has said, "Surprised to find a raft of members of my Stedman family were captains, masters and mates on the prison hulks in the late 18th and 19th century around the coast of southern England and London." Wow, I bet they saw some sights. If you look at our hulk records, they weren't pleasant places to be. And then let's have a look at one more. So Dave Ruddock has said, "My family history was started a few years ago, and after family and the greater family all helped, the little coach, or now the Priory pub at Micklegate, was the tailor shop of the Ruddocks. They came from Malton, and before that, basically along the A64. Well, it's lovely that your whole family is involved, and if anybody has any tips who's watching for getting the wider family involved, that's something I definitely struggle with. A lot of my cousins are like, "Alex, just stop." So if there's ways that I could get them a little bit more excited and help me with my research, we'd love to hear. So I think now we're 10 minutes in. I think it's story time. As our colleague Miko would say, "Let me tell you a story." That's what we're here to discuss. We're here to tell you about things we've discovered, because we don't just do family history as a job. We do it as a passion. So everyone, Niall, Jen, Brian, I know you've all kindly put some stories together. Who would like to start sharing first? Don't all volunteer at once.
Yeah, so I'll go first because the guys are just going to sit there and look into the camera. So Alex, would you put up the slide of the typed material that I sent you? So, okay, so these are actually two separate things. So I want you to pay attention to the one on the bottom first. So Henry Collins of Lynn came in the Abigail in 1635. And this is a little tidbit about my family that I have known for a number of years now. Henry Collins is my 12th, 13th, 14th, whatever, great-grandfather. He has thousands of descendants across the United States today. And so we have known from transcribed records like this and published records like this that he made that journey on the Abigail in 1635. He arrived and settled in Lynn, Massachusetts. But when Find My Past digitized and published a collection called The Registers of Licenses to Pass Beyond the Seas, that was a real moment for me. So seeing this in black and white is fine, but then Alex flipped to the image of the document.
Yeah.
Seeing the actual register is something altogether different. And he's actually on that very top of the first page with his wife, his children, their servants, essentially brought over the whole household. Seeing that original document from that time period, especially being American, where, I'm out west, so anything older than 1850 is like really, really old to me, right? So even just going to the East Coast and seeing some of the things from the 1600s is phenomenal. But seeing this document, this is by far the oldest document of my family that I've ever found. And I think probably one of the biggest moments for me is this is my dad's line. And I printed this out, nice high quality print on good paper. And I took it to him and we sat down and looked at this. And I said, this is the first ancestor we know of in the United States, well before it was the United States. And my dad is not a very emotional man, but he kind of had to turn away and take a minute because he was really struck by this. And I think this is something that I'm particularly proud of, is proving our connection to this line. Which took several years to do, and being able to sit down with my dad and show him that we've been a part of American history since literally the very beginning in terms of white European history. So this one's pretty special. And then about a year after we published these, I took a trip over to London to sit through meetings and stuff in person instead of remotely. And I was able to walk the streets. So the map that you're looking at was actually published in 1801. But it shows Ratcliffe Highway, which is where Henry Collins was from and the road he lived on. And so I walked down that road with a colleague of ours, and he had done some additional research and kind of surprised me with some findings. And we ended up at the parish where Henry Collins and his family left from, the parish of Stepney. In
I was there. That was
that was there. And you and Max followed us, and you videoed the whole thing, which was so amazing because then, after I came home, I sat down with my dad again and we walked through the whole video, and I told him what it was like and sitting through the service. And of course, it's Church of England, right, which we don't have over here. And so it was just, it's such an incredible experience, right? And it's because of Find My Past and because I have the privilege of working for an international company that I was able to do all these things. It's just amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
And what are your general thoughts on kind of the importance or the impact of visiting physical locations? I remember when we went to go to that church, you were quite emotional. And there was also that very special moment where, on the off chance, the chap walking past happened to be a deacon or something, and he knew everything about the history of it and let you inside.
Yeah, he was quite interesting, wasn't he? He was a parishioner, if I remember right. Just knew a lot about the history of the church. And so seeing the building in person and being able to walk the streets, there's nothing like that. If you ever get the opportunity to do it. I would do it again in an instant if I could, anywhere in the world. It was so amazing. And then when we sat through the service, we talked to the minister afterwards, and she was very kind. She was obviously accustomed to kind of heritage tourists coming into the building and checking things out. And she says to me, she said, "Did you see the baptismal font when you walked in?" And it was kind of right inside the door. And I'm like, "Yeah, of course I did." She said, "Well, turn around and take another look, because that's the original one. And it was put here in the 1300s. And so your ancestors were baptized in that baptismal font. And I was kind of casually like, originally when I walked in, I kind of casually grazed it with my hand, and then I turned around, and it just was like, wow, right? That's a huge wow moment, that you're seeing something, you're touching something that your ancestors 380 some odd years ago also saw and touched. I believe we've talked about this pretty extensively in my family. Pretty sure I'm the first one in my direct lineage to go back to England in almost 400 years.
Oh wow! Yeah, that's pretty significant.
Yeah. And since then, right, my ancestors.
He didn't put you off. You will be coming back
as soon as the travel ban is lit, like as soon as I can. Yeah, absolutely. I miss you guys. It's remarkable that we have this incredible story of American history in our family. My family has fought in every major engagement since the French and Indian War on this continent on behalf of the United States, right? Or it's whatever version was historically appropriate. But then to think how much history is left to uncover still from the English side is just, I don't know, it's just mind blowing.
And there's often these like coincidental connections to locations that you might not even be aware about. I mean, I'm sure people watching have heard me say this so many times, but I'm originally from the north of England. I now live in London. I live in a place called Twickenham. As soon as I moved here, for some reason, I was like, I really like it here. This is the first place I've lived in London that kind of feels like home. And then when I progressed through the Cox branch of my family tree, I ended up discovering that literally all the Coxes lived in Twickenham. I had no idea previously. Wow. It clicked. I was like, maybe that's why I feel this affinity for the place. And then I went to see the houses they used to live in, and they were rather nice. And I was like, thinking, what went wrong? Visiting a grave as well. I found the grave of my great uncle. So going to visit that was quite special. And again, I felt a strangely strong emotional connection to a guy I didn't know existed the year before.
I can definitely connect with that. I still remember, actually, my first trip over to England was because of the company. And I remember Miko reaching out to me and as soon as the plane landed, basically, how does it feel to be back on your home soil? And I'd never thought about it that way. And but he was joking, but it was kind of right. It was like, wow, I actually kind of do feel a bit of a weird connection here, and the same when I went to Scotland, and I'm sure I have ancestors from Scotland. I just haven't found them yet.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you very much for sharing that, Jen. We've had quite a few people still going away in the comments. Amanda Webb has said, Jen, you must be extremely excited to have traced your ancestry that far back in the USA. Really pleased for you. I'm sure Daphne Hanan also said, I saw the video. It was lovely. It's still on our YouTube page, if I'm correct.
It is, yeah. It is. I refer to it.
Check it out. And actually, I recommend our YouTube page. There's hundreds of hours of free, I would say, fascinating content to lose yourself in. Perfect for lockdown. Absolutely perfect. In the interest of time, should we crack on a little bit? Because I think we'd also like to answer some questions direct and have a little bit of a chat about tips for getting started. So, Brian, would you like to go next?
Certainly, be very happy to. The story I wanted to talk about was, as I said, very pertinent to me, like all family histories, really, and because it related so much to my own relationship with my father. As I think I said earlier on, I was determined to prove so much of our family history was largely elaborated or made up, or maybe there was something wrong with it, just to make a point. Could you, Alex, show up the picture of, this is the house that I grew up in, and this house on the right-hand side, this is in Wexford. This was built in the middle of the 1600s, and it was completed around 1720. And my family's been living in this house since 1694. Wow. And so I grew up here as a child. It used to be bigger, part of it burnt down. But anyway, let's not get into that too much. But my family were, I suppose, historically typical county gentry, part of the establishment of Ireland as part of the United Kingdom before independence. So they would be considered one of the sort of unionist gentry establishment. And they would have been relatively happy about that designation. My great-grandfather was chairman of the local unionist association. His father was the head of the Masons in Ireland. I mean, they were very much of a type. And not a group of people that I felt overly strongly sympathetic towards, because they lived a life of extraordinary privilege. And I found it difficult growing up having that heritage, because whilst my father was an entirely different type of person, very open-minded, very inclusive, and certainly gave me a great grounding, I felt slightly worried or embarrassed by the history because of what it was. So in my endeavors to discover more about my family history, I discovered that my ancestor who lived in this house in the late 18th century, called Richard Donovan, his brother, who was a barrister in Dublin, he turns out to have had a secret life. And I discovered this through a huge range of source materials that survive. But he was one of the leading activists in an organization called the Society of United Irishmen. This was a body set up in around 1790 to campaign for an independent Ireland that would no longer have any of the sectarian bars against Catholics or dissenter, and would actually be also try and address some of the many social problems in the country. And in fact, I discovered then later that this man, John Donovan, authored this pamphlet, which was hugely influential in the 1790s, which is, you can see the front cover of it there, Thoughts on the Necessity and Means of Educating the Poor of Ireland and Attaching Them to Their Country. He basically advocated that his people like his family, the elite, should be forced to relinquish a quarter of their assets, so that in fact the rest of the country should be educated properly, and should actually, you would then, if they were educated properly, they might actually have a reason to actually want to support Ireland or be part of it, or this was a future. So he's very much an advocate of social justice of his day.
I bet that went down well.
Well, you can only imagine what conversations may have happened within the household. But he became not only secretary, but briefly chairman of the Dublin Society of United Irishmen. He was involved in traveling to France to try and raise weaponry when they decided to actually organize a revolution in Ireland. This is after they'd been made illegal as an organization. But he wasn't simply an Irish patriot. He was an internationalist. So whilst he was campaigning for Irish independence, he was also campaigning to overthrow the monarchy in England. He joined the Republican circles there, and later on the Republican circles in the Netherlands. So his view was that the monarchy was dead. It should be got rid of. He was very inspired by the French Revolution and the American revolutions. It all went horribly wrong for him, as we know. The revolution was overthrown in Ireland. It was brutally suppressed. Over 50,000 people died, mostly in Wexford, and our house was occupied for a while. There's some images here of that time. But this was a shock to my family, because they knew nothing about who this person was. It was never, ever been raised or otherwise. And in fact, actually digging through the family archives, you could only find one record of him in the house. And it was a comment by, would have been his great niece. And she wrote a little paragraph about all the family members she'd ever known. But she only had 2 words to say about him: the Republican. Because this was the man who wanted to overthrow the monarchy and set up an independent country. So from my perspective, I was suddenly felt relieved. I had found somebody of prominence in my family who had actually been somebody I could actually respect. Oddly enough, not oddly really, my father was delighted too, because he felt equally embarrassed, and I hadn't realized this by his own heritage. So this led on a journey of discovery, after discovering this one man, to a whole other history of my family. It turned out my family, which we sort of knew anyway, were a Gaelic family of note who'd survived through all the upheavals in Irish history, the invasions, the settlements, the confiscations, all the brutal apparatus of turning Ireland into a colony of Britain. But it also told me I could learn about what it meant to live through that, because, you know, as historians and sociologists can generalize, but family history can't. Every family history is unique, has a unique story that relates to the period it goes through. It doesn't fit with generalizations most of the time. And neither did mine either. In fact, we discovered that in 1700, the family were overwhelmingly Catholic. Only the head of the family was the establishment church, because he had to be to hold on to some land. And that stayed that way for quite a while. It's just really interesting. The story is not what I thought. It wasn't what my father thought, but we were both much happier about it as a consequence.
Yeah, and the whole kind of concept of you know, you never know what you're going to discover when you start out doing this, and not all the discoveries you make will be welcome ones. You know, a former colleague I remember discovered an ancestor who committed, I mean, some seriously quite heinous crimes, as bad as they could possibly get, and was quite upset about it. But I just wonder what everybody's thoughts are on how you kind of address, deal, rationalize, if you find things that you weren't expecting to find. And same for our audience, would you hide that fact? Is it something you'd be something you've really got to take an honest look at, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. So I've known for a long time actually that my mom was born and raised in Alabama and has a long history there, and my family were enslavers, and that's a story that I'm not, certainly not proud of by any sense, but it's a story that I need to tell. It's research that I need to do, because the people who were impacted the most, of course, were the people who were enslaved, and their descendants today deserve the chance to know that story and to see those documentation. If they can't find it, because of course those individuals were treated as property and not as humans, I'm the link, right? I'm the research link between the enslaved descendants and their ancestors. If I can find that material and put it out there for the world to see, then it's easier for them to find. I think we, as family historians, even as just amateur historians interested in the past, we have a responsibility to share all aspects of history, good, bad, ugly, or amazing.
Yeah, we say every story matters, but it's very true.
Yeah.
Even the bad ones. Sometimes
the bad ones.
Yeah.
Often the bad ones matter actually more.
Yeah, I mean, quite a lot. Whenever we see people comment, in quite a lot of the stories that I shared are often quite tragic or sad. I guess reflecting on that a bit more, I do think one of the important reasons to do your family history research is because it not only does it help kind of establish or inform the relationships and connections you have in the present, I also think it can impact how you view yourself and how you can live your life going forward. And I just wondered if any of you have any thoughts on, have any of you been directly influenced to make a life decision or the way you conduct yourselves, I don't know, based on something you've discovered?
I think if I go into my story, that could lead on nicely to this. I don't think it's totally changed, made a decision for me in my life, but it's certainly given me a new perspective on things. And my story is probably the other end of the spectrum in terms of the Irish story that Brian's was. So my family, it's kind of I call it my zero to hero story. So my great grandfather, my father's grandfather, was Charles Albert Cullen. And I discovered him in Findmypast's Dublin workhouse registers, and they're exclusive to Findmypast. You can only get them online there. If you do have Dublin ancestors, I totally recommend you to go in and look at them, because the detail in them is unbelievable. So I found Charles Albert there. He was in there he was only 9 years old at the time when he was in the workhouse registers. That's them there. Yeah, thanks, Alex, for sharing. And these, like I say, really detailed. They give his age, his address. It's actually how I knew I had the right Charles Cullen, is because I was able to cross-reference this record with other records to see that they had the same address on it. But he's only 9 years old when he's in the workhouse in the late 1800s, and he's there with his mother and with his two younger siblings. And the youngest of those siblings was only 10 months old at the time. So that already kind of paints a real picture of what this family must have been going through at the time. A 10-month-old child is living in the workhouse. That can't have been easy for the mother. There's no sign of the father in there at the time, so it looks like she was a single mother trying to raise three kids. So yeah, for me, that's kind of an upsetting find to find originally. And then you kind of work through Charles Albert's story and where else can you find him in records. Around a decade later, maybe it's slightly less even than a decade later, he was serving in the British Army. So I found him in British Army service records, and he served in the Boer War, and he won medals for that. So that's how it's kind of a real kind of zero to hero story for me. He started, the first time I found him is in the workhouse. He's got nothing. He's down and out. His family are really struggling. 10 years later, he's managed to turn his life around and actually win some medals and actually do something to be really proud of. So yeah, I think that going back to your original question, how this has kind of changed me, I guess it's kind of given me the if I didn't have this already instilled in me, it's given me another chance to think that, never give up. There will be tough times. God knows we're all going through tough times at the moment. It's a really tough time for the whole world, but actually keep going, and there will be light at the end of the tunnel. You can turn your life around, and never give up. I suppose that's what that discovery has kind of given to me.
Yeah, that's something I've definitely been trying to use at the moment as well. As you said, last year's been an interesting one for most of us. And yeah, I'll often, when I'm feeling a little bit sorry for myself, I'll think about, for example, my great grandfather, Leonard Leslie Nash, who had a terrible time on the Western Front in World War II. He was at World War One, sorry, World War II. He was at most of the he was at the Somme. He was at a few of the other rather hairy ones. And I was fortunate enough to find a service record for him that was incredibly detailed, and also listed quite a long and very unpleasant category of injuries. Namely being he was shot in the right arm. He was also gassed. It did terrible damage to his lungs. You can see him being shipped to various hospitals all over the UK and France for treatment for his chest. And then after that, he was sent back. And this guy had a horrific experience. And if I'm being a bit grim on a Monday, I'm like, well, I'm hardly storming the German trenches at the back of the Somme, am I? And try and take a little bit of strength from that. I know it's easier said than done. And he's a man that I actually was lucky enough to remember. He reached the ripe old age of 100 and died in 1999. And he was quite an eccentric character. And it wasn't until after his death. So actually, that's another thing I hadn't thought about. Researching people can kind of almost give you new insights into people you knew, people that have since passed away. So my great grandfather was very well known for his eccentricities. He was actually quite a serious hoarder. He would never throw anything away. He was also deeply socialist to the point where he was quite fixated, and everything would be brought back to socialism. Well, after going through, I knew he'd served in the First World War, but I didn't know the extent of how awful it was for him. And after reading about a lot of his experiences, that put quite a lot of it into context. I was like, well, he was a private in an infantry regiment. No wonder he was quite socialist. He would have seen some of the perils of the British class system in action on the front lines. So one of the things my grandmother never forgave him for was giving away. There was a few family properties in Cornwall, and he gave them to the tenants because owning them didn't agree with his socialist principles. And my grandmother was very upset. But after discovering that, I was like, oh, that actually it kind of makes sense. And same with the kind of hoarding. I think that was just a result of the terrible post-traumatic stress he probably experienced, but was never diagnosed because it wasn't really a thing back then. I don't know if any of have you guys had any experiences of researching someone that you once knew but it's passed away, and it's kind of opened things up a bit?
Well, this is kind of a fresh question for me because I've been working on my mom's side of the family, and she hasn't been gone very long. But I will defer back to a different story. My grandma, the one that gave me the cookies, I inherited most of her papers. And she was involved in the Dairy Wives of Washington. So it was an organization that started in her county. Obviously, my grandfather was a dairy farmer. And she was quite vocal about it. And she was not a subtle woman by any means. It might have inspired my personality a little. But she was quite... what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. She was aggressive, right? If she was sitting in a meeting and someone went off topic, that was not okay. And you see it reflected in the meeting minutes that she kept for this organization. She was the president for a couple of years. And at one point, there was a radio station locally who they had an agricultural reporter, right? And so they did a report on the dairy community. And they were saying things that she didn't necessarily agree with. And so in these papers, I was able to find a copy of this letter that she wrote to this reporter on the radio station, and scathing comments around how badly he represented the dairy community and the dairy economy. And then his response back, right, on official letterhead and everything was, "You write such a succinct and direct letter. I must applaud you for your passion." And it was a very politically correct response, I think. But it really gave me a different perspective. And when I shared that letter that I found with my siblings, I remember my sister saying something to the effect of, "Oh, that sounds just like grandma. That's so her." But I didn't have that perspective of her. I had the cozy grandmother who sat down with me and told me stories and gave me cookies. And that was my memory. But my siblings had a much different perspective of grandma and who she was in her personality. And it was just an interesting dichotomy to see how they perceived her versus myself.
Yeah, and actually on the subject of personality, I wonder whether, sometimes I've been looking in depth at the lives of my ancestors, and I've picked up on what appear to be personality traits coming through the records that I definitely recognize in myself. Actually, I'll show you an example. Apologies to everybody who watched me last Friday, because I did talk about this chap, but this is my three times great grandfather, Arthur William Crossland, who went by the stage name Professor Chris Leno. He was a magician, a ventriloquist, and by all accounts, just a big personality. And I know I quite like attention. I bask in it. I think based on this advert for his show, where he describes himself as being praised by all, imitated by many, and excelled by none. I'm not saying that's how I describe myself, but I think that kind of theatrical side of my personality may well have come from this chap here.
Maybe you should put that on your business card, Alex. I think that's...
I've considered it, and unfortunately the ability to grow an incredibly impressive moustache was not carried through in the genes. I couldn't imitate that even if I tried. But yeah, there's been a few occasions where I've spotted things like that, or in newspaper reports. I go, do you know what? I see a little bit of I can relate to that. I see a little bit of myself in that, and I was wondering whether any of you have examples of that yourselves.
I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I suppose some of the stuff that you learn from records might not show like you might not get the personality coming through. I guess newspapers will be one way to actually delve in further and see what was your ancestor up to, what type of things were they involved in, and that might give you indications to the personality. But I certainly can't think of one off the top of my head. They're probably lucky. I mean, I'm unique.
Well, actually, great point as well. Newspapers are probably one of the richest sources I think that you can have access to online. And I think I guess there's two approaches to doing your family history, really, isn't there? There are those who probably describe themselves as tree builders, people who are very much focused on names, dates, just stretching that tree back, adding as many ancestors as they can, getting as far back in history as they can. And I think I'm more of the approach. I like stories. I like finding the color and the context in between. So kind of on that note, I just wondered what all three of you, your general top tips, one, for finding that color and context, but two, how do you keep a record of it, and how do you keep track of all that? Because it's hard to add that to your tree, isn't it? It's almost like two kind of brain dumps, really.
Yeah, you really kind of need two different platforms for documenting your research. I'm gonna tackle the second part of your question there, Alex. One of my biggest suggestions, always, is to just write as you research. Right? It's really easy to just jump into an internet site or Findmypast and dig up as many records as you can possibly find. But if you aren't reading those records and actually putting them in a context while you're doing that, you lose that inspiration that you have in the moment. So when I research, I typically have, whatever I'm looking at on one screen or on one tab, and I have my writing software somewhere else, and I'm constantly writing, even if it's, in many times it's very narrative, right? I'm almost talking to myself as I research. And the reason for that is because it allows me to document my initial findings and my initial impression of that material that I'm looking at, but it also helps me kind of organize my thoughts so I can go, oh, you know what? I bet he was part of the Freemasons, for example. I should look at that. So I make a note for myself, even though it's something I could chase right there at that moment. Instead, I'm documenting that inspirational thought or that potential research thread and saying, I need to look at this later because I'm still focused on, whatever my research plan has in front of me today. And I think it's especially true with things like newspapers, right? Because you never know what you're going to find in newspapers, and so you might be led down 100 different paths in an hour, and the temptation is to chase each one of those little threads as soon as you learn about it. But what you really need to do is stay focused on just digging through the newspaper and finding everything you can, and then going after all of that research later.
Wow, great advice.
It's a very good advice there. Could I add one or two things to the first part of your question there of what you should be looking at? Because I think one of the things that I think is important that users or people do is actually go and talk and get as much family history as you can, the oral history. Now, I know I was giving out about it earlier on, saying I was trying to prove things wrong. I prove more things right than wrong. And in fact, actually, generally speaking, where I found interesting stuff, and this is my main point, is in the gaps where the oral history is silent, where it doesn't make any sense. Why do we not know anything about that? I mean, we know stuff all around it, but that big bit here is missing. That often could be a big clue as to the fact that there's a story there worth investigating. But yeah, the difficulty is finding evidence which will fill in the story. And of course, newspapers are a brilliant resource. But so again, this is where court records become very useful, because it's amazing how many people ended up, most of us have had one reason or other to attend a court case during our lives, maybe as a witness, maybe as a not necessarily as a defendant, but maybe, who knows? The point is that at a district court,
we wouldn't talk about that, Brian.
Well, but what I'm trying to say is that if you're looking at your family, you've got to think that there's going to be a lot of people who may have gone through these things, and these can be a real window into the stories or the things that are left unsaid. I'm not sure about whether this plays out in every country, but certainly in Ireland, we have been afflicted almost by a culture of respectability, so that an awful lot is not talked about, or an awful lot is just simply forgotten rather than made up.
Your point, Brian, about gaps in oral history, I think, is especially important. It's, if you create a timeline of your ancestor based on oral history or what you already know or what you've already researched, and you see a 10-year gap, that's your cue to look at larger national or global history and say what was happening in the world at that time, right? There's a huge gap in my family's oral history because my mom would never talk about growing up in a racially divided southern state. And so I'm trying to now fill in the gaps of her story, because she didn't want to share that, right? And similar with Alex, with your grandfather, right? His PTSD from the war probably made it very difficult for him to talk about those experiences. And so how do you fill that in without hurting your relationship, I guess, with family members that are still living?
Context really does matter.
It really does.
And yeah, it's often easy to overlook. You can get so fixated on learning about the individual person that you kind of neglect to step back and take a look at the wider scenario, what was actually going on. And that's something that's definitely added loads to my sense of my ancestors and myself today, is kind of not just learning about their lives, but learning about the times they lived through and what was going on around them, really.
Just to add as well, a tip around how, getting back to your question on how do you actually find the colour and context, and not just the names and the dates. We talk about this all the time, but always I would advise everyone to always check the original record image if it's available. Like a lot of genealogy websites, ours included, obviously transcribe the most important details because they're really useful for building family trees, but often some of the most colourful details aren't transcribed, so you won't find them when you search. But if you can get hold of, whether it's online or whether it's the physical record itself, check the original record, because whether it's a note in the margin of a baptism record or whether it's the physical description in a military record, this is where you're getting that colour and context. For instance, back to my great-grandfather, I know that he had a birthmark on his right arm because of his physical description in his military record. Where else would I get that kind of information? So that's why it's really important. And again, it helps you to build up kind of what that person was like. I might not ever see a photograph of him, but I have a photograph in my mind of what he looked like because of the colour that I found in the records.
Yeah. I would
incredible.
say one of the things I've learned most importantly, I think, working for this company especially, is the importance of looking at everything. So, for example, if you're sitting in the United States and you think that British newspapers don't have anything to contribute to your research, I'm here to tell you you're totally wrong. You should be looking in international newspapers, no matter where you're placed in the world. I found an article not too long ago, actually, in our newspaper collection from my hometown where I grew up. And I know it's my hometown because it's the only one in the world. And Alex, I think you actually have it in that first slide of mine. It talks about a fire in my hometown that was never part of our oral history tradition as a family, even though we were very much in that town when that occurred. And I'd never heard this story before until I found it. And I think it was in a Scottish newspaper. Where the people of the town were essentially evacuated, and the fire was on either sides of the train as it's pulling out of town. And no one had ever talked about this before. And I kind of probed as to why this wasn't part of our oral history. And the general sense is, well, they just didn't want to repeat it. It was too traumatic. It was too traumatic of an event to think about. So I went back and tried to recreate that search in US-based newspapers, but they're not digitized. They're not available online. I can't access them today. They're sitting in a library in Washington State. So the only source I have is this international newspaper telling me about this really crucial event in a relatively modern time frame. I think it was 1914, 1915, that period when that happened. So it's modern enough to be in modern memory of my family, but no one ever talked about it before.
Mm. Well, actually, looking at the time, before we answer some quick questions, so just to kind of end the discussion, as well as kind of we've touched on some top tips there already. If you've got any more kind of top tips you want to share before we look at questions, feel free. But also, kind of maybe just a comment on the importance of family history and why people should do it. Really, it's a tough one.
There are so many reasons why people might want to do it. I wouldn't want to sort of like prejudge that. I mean, I said my reasons were quite selfish. Often there's other equally good reasons which are as well, but sometimes it's about sharing. But either way, there's such richness in your history of understanding why you are in the place you are today, which has been generated by these previous generations who had their own experiences and they dealt with things in the way they best could. And just understanding that is worth it in itself, I think.
I think there's also something around legacy as well. I think the work we're doing will hopefully benefit our descendants. One of the points you said at the start, Brian, was getting oral history and speaking to relatives. I discussed it on here before, but my grandfather, who was a D-Day veteran, never spoke about the war until he was 90, and my mother and I were able to convince him because we were aware that he was, of a great age. We're able to sit him down and record him recounting these incredibly detailed experiences of his time during the war, things he literally hadn't spoken about for 70 odd years. And he's no longer with us, but I feel very lucky to I have a son myself now. And when my son is of an age, I can show him these videos and go, that was your grandfather. That is what he did. He was an incredible man. You never knew him, but you can kind of get to know him. So I think that, obviously that's another reason for people to do it, to leave something behind, to pass this knowledge on to future generations.
Yeah, totally. And I think as well, I mean, there's no getting away from it. It's part of your story. It's part of you, your family history is. So, we always say, actually looking back at the past can actually help shape your present and possibly even your future. And I think that's really, really true. And what you might find, like I said, what I found gives me a new perspective in, never giving up and kind of thinking back to his story if there's ever tough times and things. But yeah, it has that power. It actually has the power to kind of transform how you see things, what your perspective is on life. And let's face it, a lot of us might be spending a lot more time at home in the near future. So there's probably no better way to spend your time than looking up your family history. It's all there. It's at your fingertips. Most of it is online. So there's no excuses for anybody not to delve in a little bit, I don't think.
You can travel through time from the safety of home. We should use that somewhere.
I think it makes us slightly better members of our community today, right? If we understand the stories of history and what brought us into the world, as Brian and Niall have both said, but not just as individuals, but as communities, right? I have a much better understanding of American history, English history, certainly, because of my research. But it also inspires me to act and inspires me to be a better person and inspires me to be more inclusive and think of things in a different way, and be intentional about making my world more diverse and inclusive.
Well, on that note, actually, I think there's a great question to take from this, which is actually sent in specifically for you, Niall. This is actually quite a big one. So this is for Niall from Fiona Winter, who said, Niall, what is Findmypast doing to encourage younger generations into genealogy as a company?
Interesting question, Fiona. And on that one, I would say actually watch this space, because we are obviously, a lot of us are back in lockdown at the moment. We are looking at ways that we can kind of fill people's time at home. And that includes, how do we get kids involved in family history? Because a lot of people are homeschooling at the moment. So we are looking at ways. So I would say watch this space, and there might be something coming up in the next few weeks for exactly that.
You heard it from the man himself. Watch this space. I seem to have lost the question, but I can remember it. This was one for Brian. Someone's after a bit of a scoop. Someone basically asked, what are the kind of future record acquisition plans for Ireland? Can you tease? No problem if you can't. I imagine a lot of this is sensitive, but can you tease anything that's on the horizon in terms of new Irish records at Findmypast?
Well, we continue our long-running campaign to actually try and bring together all of the remaining Porlo records together. That's going to be a project that goes on throughout my life, I bet. It's not going to happen any day soon to complete, but we've already published quite a bit of material over the course of the last couple of years, and we have a lot more coming out over the next while to try and flesh that out. For those of you, I've seen a couple of questions about, what workhouse registers are where. There aren't that many surviving workhouse registers. There's an interesting story behind that, but what we do have surviving are the Border Guardian minute books, which often deal with individual case studies, which are much richer when you do get them. So we're going to be doing a lot of those, continue that project. We will continue as well to try and do more Irish newspapers, because this really is one of the great potential resources which has been underutilized in Ireland. You've got to remember the Irish population were literate at a much earlier date than you might think. Certainly they're literate 30 years plus before England. Like so many other things, the newfangled idea of national education was trialed out in Ireland first in the 1820s. It only came into England in the 1860s. And it's one of the reasons why the Irish were very employable in America, is because they could read and write, whereas often their English counterparts couldn't. So yeah, we because of that, newspapers are written for people who can read and write, who read particularly. So newspapers have a much greater value for Irish research before the famine than I think a lot of people realize. So we want to do a lot more of that.
Brilliant. Actually, someone's just there's a comment I've lost again. Sorry. So to everybody watching, thank you so much for the comments. There's been so many. I'm struggling to actually keep up. Thank you very much. Do keep coming in. And sorry if we didn't get to your question. But there was, where is it? I'll recap. Someone saying, Brian, reading about your discovery is actually what inspired them to start looking into their own Irish roots and learning more about that period of Irish history and the struggles their ancestors kind of endured. So there you go. What we're doing now is already having impact. We are inspiring, which is certainly what we're trying to do. Amanda Webb again has said, I knew all my great-grandparents. They passed away when I was an adult. You published the Burton Chronicle and Observer last year, discovered articles on all my grandparents. A photograph of my 12-year-old paternal grandmother raising money for the comfort funds for World War II. Dad had no idea of this. It's always amazing finding a photo, and that can kind of make that connection feel so much more real. I mean, newspapers is always a place we recommend for people to look. I was just wondering if you guys had any other tips on potentially trying to track down images, because I know that can be a real challenge sometimes.
I found success in finding images of similar things, right? So even if I can't find a particular image of my ancestor, I can find an image of the town he was in, or someone serving in the same occupation in the same era, or local photograph of showing the clothing they wore, the type of house they lived in, or and some such. When we published the photo collection on Findmypast, we did those Canadian World War II photos, and I found it interesting because my dad was a photographer in the United States Navy for many, many years. And so I sent a couple to him and said, hey, check this out. We got some cool old, World War II photos, and they have some cameras in the shots. And that opened up an incredible number of stories that I'd never heard before of my dad's service, because some of the cameras they were using in World War II were the same ones he was issued in the first
Oh,
years of
wow.
his service, but, significantly later, right? And it's what he trained on when he was in photography school with the Navy. And he was able to tell me these incredible stories just because the picture of a camera brought them all back to him, right? And so even if you can't find a picture of your specific person, look for pictures of the place, the time, the equipment, the whatever that can trigger the memories, or at least give you some sense of what their experience was like.
Yeah, a good comment actually from Sue has said one of the things she's felt is that discovering our roots has made her actually less judgmental, because it's made her realize we are a product of such a varied past. There were many forks in the road that led to us all being here, and that certainly can help you kind of have a slightly broader mind, I think. Just trying to more questions. Actually, a general question for everybody. Actually, I've seen quite a few people ask similar things at different dates or different locations. What happens when you get stuck? I mean, it happens to pretty much all of us at some point in the journey. I've hit loads of brick walls over the years, and there's 2 or 3 of them that I still haven't broken down. I mean, my initial piece of advice would be just don't give up. Every day, every new day is a better day than yesterday to research, because at the rate at which new material is coming online. But I just wondered if you guys had any top brick wall busters that you'd want to share.
Something I usually recommend is, if you get stuck on one single ancestor, maybe look at their siblings or their cousins or their uncles or their aunts. So maybe go sideways on your family tree rather than trying to go back all the time. So if you're stuck on one person, if you look at their brother or sister, there might be a record surrounding their brother or sister that then unlocks something else for that original ancestor. So that's always a way to work around things. Don't dwell on it. Don't get really stuck on it and keep trying to plug away at the same person for a long time, because you'll just get really frustrated. Work sideways and work around. Also, as Jen mentioned, around the community as well. So if you find them in a newspaper, what were they doing and who else was involved, and then research that person. So this is how you dig up all the story surrounding the particular person, and then hopefully it'll lead you back to them.
Yeah, and to continue on that thread, Niall, there is a point where you get too frustrated, where you just can't see straight anymore, right? So take a break. It's okay to give your brain a break. Work on some other family, or work on some other person that's interesting for a couple of weeks, and then come back to it. And I quite literally get my whiteboard out and just start writing stuff out, just whatever comes to my brain. I also like to recommend that people educate themselves, right? A brick wall is not really insurmountable. It's just an opportunity to learn. So take a break from genealogy records and grab a book off your shelf about history of that area, or that military conflict or whatever. Start digging around in academic sources and read some journal articles about that topic and that time frame, that place, whatever it is that's got you stuck. The more you learn, the more opportunities you find for research and records.
No, that's great advice. So a few people have noticed commenting, said next time I need to put a shilling in the meter because my room's gone very dark. Sorry about that. That was my poor planning. I kind of forgot about sunset. Don't know how that happened. But yeah, I think that kind of brings us up nicely to closing time. I think. I think we can all agree that family history is an incredibly worthwhile pastime. It can really help you, reassess the connections you have now, the relationships you have, and the decisions you make. But I also think, one of the things we've really, if you can take a positive over the past troubling year, one of the silver linings we have seen is that many people are taking this difficult period as an opportunity to learn more about their roots. And I think we were all genuine believers that the more people that do it, the easier it becomes for everybody. And there's benefits to be reaped by all. So thank you Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Niall. And thank you so much to everybody who's been tuning in. Sorry we didn't get through all your comments. There was a lot of them, but it's been great seeing them come through. If you enjoyed this, which I hope you did, and this is your first time, I have seen a few people saying they were newbies. We hope we do videos like this on a regular basis, normally on our Facebook page, but also on our YouTube channel, so keep updated. Tomorrow is no different. You can join the one and only Miko Cleland at 4 p.m. tomorrow afternoon. And then next week, I believe Ellie is hosting a very special Australia Day chat about coats of arms. So if you're curious about your coats of arms, be sure to tune in. But yeah, I think all that's left to say is thank you, everybody. We all agree that family history is just the best. Keep researching, stay in touch, and goodbye. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.